Rob here at etrailer.com, and today you're going to be taking a look at the SumoSprings Rebel custom helper springs for the front axle on our 2012 Tiffin Allegro Motorhome. Now here at eTrailer we get a lot of questions about motorhomes, specifically about suspension upgrades. Because let's face it, whether you're new or you've been driving a motorhome for a while, we realize that they don't handle all that well, they're pretty bumpy, and there's a lot of area here for the wind to catch, which means that we're going to start getting pushed around on the highway. If we get a strong gust of wind, a truck drives by, we end up fighting that steering wheel because we're getting pushed to the side, not to mention everybody in the back's getting tossed around. We really can't enjoy our motorhome. So before we put our suspension components on, let's take it out on our test course and see how our motorhome handles. As I'm driving through the test course, going over the bumps, without the suspension in place, it's definitely a jarring feeling and it's resonating through the seat. And when I get the alternating speed bumps, it's definitely swaying a lot more than I really like side to side. Just feel like I need to slow down and have a really firm grip on the steering wheel. And as I come up to the slalom course, again, it feels like I need to slow down. I'm going in and out of the turns, but the motorhome is leaning and then turning. Scary feeling when you're driving and you go to turn the wheel and the motorhome doesn't respond right away. Now that everything's in place, let's take our motorhome back out on the test course and see how the handling improved. As soon as I get on our bump course, I can immediately feel a difference. The bumps are there, don't get me wrong, but it genuinely feels like the motorhome's a little bit smaller than it is, it reacts a lot quicker, and once we get over the bumps, we're not continuing to bounce down the road. It reacts a lot quicker, responds quicker, and it's just a lot more comfortable to drive and I can just relax a little bit. As we come up to the slalom course and I'm going in and out of the turns, it's definitely reacting quicker. When I turn, it actually wants to turn rather than just start leaning. And I feel I can go a little bit faster and again just relax a little bit and enjoy myself. Our Sumo springs in the front are going to greatly reduce the amount of body roll and sway feeling that we have when we're driving down the road, all while giving us a nice comfortable ride. Now it's going to alleviate a lot of those problems because it's going to mount directly to the top of the frame and the bottom of the axle right here on top of the leaf springs. Now you see the spring in the center, that's what's going to absorb all those road shocks and give us the support we need. But you'll notice that there's going to be a small crease. And that's because there are actually two separate pieces, which is going to give us unlimited amount of suspension travel. Which means if we hit a bump, obviously the motorhome's going to go down with the initial bump, but the rebound where it comes back up, or if we hit a big dip where the axle wants to come down, this is going to allow it to move freely and not limit the amount of suspension travel that we have. Now our springs are going to have a progressive load control, which means they're going to compress according to the weight that we have on them. So if you have a lot of extra weight or we're pushing a lot of force on these, they're going to compress as much to 80% for support and become a lot stiffer. But if we don't have that much weight and we're not pressing down too hard on them, the springs are going to compress easily at first for a soft engagement and give us a comfortable ride. A lot of suspension upgrades do give you more support, but they tend to give you a really stiff, bumpy ride. Well, these are going to be a lot softer in engagement whenever they're first starting out. We're going to have one spring on each side of our motorhome. That way they can work independently. So if we take a sharp turn, we're going to reduce that body roll because one side is going to compress while the other side is stretching open, so we can keep a nice level ride even on level surfaces. The blue section of our spring is going to be made out of a microcellular urethane, so it is going to withstand most automotive chemicals like oil, salt, and even UV rays, and it's going to work all the way down to -25 degrees, so if we're taking a trip up in the mountains where it gets pretty cold, we don't have to worry about it, but it's also going to go all the way up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so if we're down in the desert taking a trip, we don't have to worry about any kind of environmental issues damaging our springs. The other nice thing about it is the fact that these are going to be completely maintenance free. Compared to some of the other options like airbags, those are going to be a little bit more involved getting them installed, and we're going to have to run air lines, worrying about maintaining air pressure. With these, once they're installed, we can completely forget about them and start enjoying our motorhome right away. Our springs are going to have a 2,600 pound weight capacity, but keep in mind they're not meant to increase the weight capacity of your motorhome, they're just there to help support the weight and give us a nice comfortable ride. They are going to include everything you need to get them installed, including the brackets, the hardware, and both spring assemblies. But now that we've seen what they look like and gone over some of the features, let's put one side on together. To begin our installation, we want to park our motorhome on a nice flat level surface. Now we're going to need to raise up the front end of our motorhome, but we don't have to raise it to where the tires are off the ground. We can use the front leveling jacks just to raise it up enough so the suspension has some stretch to it and we get a little bit more room to work with. Now we can move underneath, right by the front axle. Now right above the front axle, we'll find our frame and we'll have our factory joust stop. We need to remove this, so you want to grab a short extension and a 13mm socket. We'll feed the socket up through the bottom of the hole in the joust stop. Now you want to break it loose, just so it's easier to come out, but if we look on top of the frame here, there's going to be a nut that we're going to have to hold with a wrench. So we can grab a 15mm wrench, and we'll hold the nut while we remove the bolt. And once we have our joust stop removed, we want to hold on to the bolt and the nut, but we can get rid of the actual joust stop itself. Next, we want to grab our upper bracket. You'll see that it's going to kind of have a little bump in the middle. You want to make sure that that's facing up. And then also it's going to have 3 holes in it. We'll have 2 on either side and 1 in the very center. The one in the very center, we're going to take the factory bolt and we're going to feed it through the bottom going up, just like this. But before we reattach it to the frame, we want to make sure that we grab 2 3/8 bolts and we're going to drop them down from the top of the bracket so they're hanging down just like this. Then we'll take our bracket, make sure it's sitting against the frame. It's got these little tabs here at the very top. You want to make sure that those are sitting against the frame and they don't move like this. But we'll hold our bracket up there. We'll get our factory nut loosely started. Then we can grab that socket and wrench and tighten it up all the way. Once it starts to get close, again, you just want to make sure that it's sitting properly and that those ears are grabbing the edge of the frame. Next, we're going to want to grab our upper spring. You'll notice there's going to be 4 holes that are threaded in the top section, and there'll be a large open section in the bottom. So when we hold it up, we want it to face like this, and 2 of the threaded holes are going to line up with the bolts dropping down. So we'll line up our spring, and we're just going to get them loosely started by hand, just a couple threads, so it'll hold the spring in place. We don't have to worry about it dropping. Once you have it loosely secure, you're going to want to grab a 9/16 ratcheting wrench because it's very limited in here to get a wrench in there and tighten it up. And I do suggest alternating because if you tighten one side up too much, the bolt will raise up and then we won't be able to get our wrench out. Next, we can assemble the lower section of our spring. We'll grab our lower bracket, and if we look at it, we're going to have somewhat of a shorter end that's got a tail on it, and then a taller end that has this large opening. That large opening in the taller section is going to go towards the front of our motorhome. You also notice there's going to be 2 slots in the bracket. Those slots are going to line up with the threaded hole that's at the bottom of our lower spring section, and we want to use the inner hole. So if this is towards the front, we use this hole. We'll place our spring over, flip it over, make sure that the holes are lining up. We'll take another one of those 3/8 flange bolts. And right now we're just going to loosely get this in place, just hand tight. But you want to make sure there's still plenty of movement in that spring in the bracket so it can slide back and forth. So we'll take our lower section. I'm just going to sneak it in so that it can sit on top of our leaf spring pack and so that the spring can get underneath the upper one. Now you'll notice up here in the front section where those 2 tabs are, it's going to go right around that top leaf spring plate and it'll pretty much secure itself pretty good in position. Now the reason why we wanted to leave our upper spring loose, so you can see we're going to try to line it up with our upper spring so when the suspension comes down, that inner section will go into the hole and then come together. So we want to get it right about where it's going to line up. And in our case, the spring is slid all the way towards the front. So we can either get a wrench and try to sneak it in through here, or we can just lift the assembly up, take it out, slide our spring all the way to the front, and tighten it up. That's what we're going to do because it's going to be a little bit easier just to grab the spring like this and tighten up that bolt. And to tighten up this bolt, I'm going to use a 9/16 socket. Once we know our spring is nice and secure, it's not moving anymore, we'll just reinsert the assembly back onto the spring. Make sure it still lines up. Then on the front here, on top, we're going to have 2 square holes that are going to be on either side of our leaf spring. We want to grab the long carriage bolts out of our kit. We're going to drop them down. You want to make sure that square on the end of the carriage bolt slides into the hole that's in the bracket. Do that both for the front. Then on the back, we're going to have the same style holes in a lower section. So we'll grab the shorter carriage bolts and drop those through those holes. Now on the bottom where those bolts came through, we want to grab one of our clamps. You'll notice it's going to kind of have a C or a U shape to it. You want the flat section to be on the bottom of the leaf spring, so when it's up against the leaf spring, it sits like this. So we'll line up our bolt holes with the holes that are in the bracket. Kind of have to sneak it around the sway bar here. Might help if you lift up the bolt just a bit and drop it down back through the bracket. Once we have both of those in place, I'm going to grab a 3/8 flange nut. We're just going to loosely get those on until we can get all of the nuts in place. Now I'm going to come back with a 9/16 socket, and when you tighten up the nuts, you want to alternate going back and forth between the two so it gets a nice even clamping force and that bracket doesn't bind up. And with everything snugged down, that'll finish our install on this side. Now the passenger side is going to install exactly the same with one exception. You can see that there's no access to the inside of the frame rail on the passenger side, so we're not going to be able to access that nut. But luckily that nut is welded inside, so all you have to worry about is using the bolt underneath. That'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings Rebel Custom Helper Springs for the front axle on our 2012 Tiffin Allegro Motorhome.